Greetings cats and kittens, welcome once again to Baggy Hi Fi, this YouTube channel devoted to record collecting and the vinyl community here in the UK. A couple of months ago I made a video showing some vintage music magazines, and all of them were British publications of the fanzine variety, that is put together by fans of a particular kind of music. And I'm pretty sure that the aim of those creators of those fanzines wasn't to be professional or to compete with the shelves of W.H. Smith. But what comes through, I think, in those fanzines is the passion and the desire to share opinions and enthusiasm about groups and artists that those editors or writers had a particular passion for. I think it can't be said enough that before the internet, fanzines and the music press in general were the main way that music fans were able to find out about artists and bands and record releases. Yes, you could listen to the radio, in particular to shows like John Peel, or go around to a friend's house and see what they'd bought and listen to what they'd bought, albums. Or you could share mixtapes. That was another way of sharing music with one another and spreading the word about particular artists that we liked. But there was no equivalent then of streaming or of listening to a record really before you took the plunge and bought it. There was no way through any other media really other than mainly the music press and the radio to a certain extent. So in this video I'm going to go back down memory lane and show some more vintage music magazines, fanzines in particular. This time round fanzines from the USA. Well, the oldest of this batch of USA fanzines is this one, Bump magazine. This is from winter 1976 to 1977, and Bump magazine was a quarterly magazine edited by Greg Shaw. Now, Greg Shaw is an interesting figure, quite an important figure in the sort of rediscovery of garage music and psych music of the 60s. He started a record label which put out the Pebbles series, definitely a response to the original Lenny Kaye Nuggets compilation. So Greg certainly tried to promote what he would call real rock and roll, and the editorial here is quite telling. I'll just read you a little bit from it, Greg Shaw's editorial. Something about this magazine seems to make people want to express their innermost feelings about rock and roll and what it means in their lives. Nothing strange about it. Bump is written by and for people who take the music seriously and relate to it on a deeper, more emotional level than, say, your average Kraftwerk fan. What's strange is that we seem to be a minority. If Bump appears at times to be more concerned with events 10 years ago than with today, it's only because some of us remember a time when rock and roll mattered to everybody, or at least everybody we knew. The music elicited such a strong sense of involvement from its fans that it became an integral part of our existence. And the involvement was only intensified by the thriving pop culture that surrounded rock and roll in its better days. So even in this fanzine from the late 70s, there's a nostalgia for the 60s and sort of 60s rock and roll. There's an interview there with Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, of course. Interesting to see some of the adverts for releases of the time in the kind of late 70s power pop vein. So here's looking back to the Monkees and a discography. Now, I think, you know, rock and roll was becoming, or rock writers were becoming more conscious of that rock and roll was worth documenting. And so there we are with discographies and lists. An article on Mexican punk there, it's quite interesting. Article on Boston bands of the time. Not many of them I've heard of, apart from the Modern Lovers, of course. Article on Jack Nietzsche, Dictators. So you got here some little articles about what was happening in New York. Of course, CBGBs and Patti Smith, Television, Johnny Thunders, Debbie Harry. Now here we are. This is Greg Shaw showing his passion for 60s garage punk and beat music and psych music. This is an article on, very detailed article on Swedish 60s music. Vote for your favourite punk. And then the record reviews as well. So there's Dave Edmunds' review of Bay City Rollers album. I think they were quite big in the USA. And list of fanzines, books. I wish I had more copies of this magazine. And then people selling records, because remember this is way before the internet. And this is part B of Encyclopedia of British Rock. So there's lots of research going on in here in this Bump magazine. There are the Flaming Groovies on the back with an advert for their Shake Some Action album. This next American fanzine is Kicks magazine, issue number 6 from 1988, edited by Billy Miller and Miriam Lina, based in New York. This is a really strong issue, but look how small the type is in here. This is just absolutely packed with enthusiastic writing for rock and roll, garage music, rockabilly. There's a really funny response to, I think in the previous issue there must have been some kind of taking the mickey of Sting, of the Police, and Sting was very upset by it and wrote a letter, but the editors continue to respond in a very disrespectful way to that wonderful rock star King, Sting. So anyway, this is all about rock and roll. Again, looking back to the 60s and the 50s as well. Billy Miller and Miriam Lina, I think they founded Norton Records, which have released a lot of old rock and roll music. It's a big long article about the Bobby Fuller 4. Again, discographies. This is a magazine from the 80s, looking back at the 60s and 50s, and also bands playing, contemporary bands from the 80s playing in that vein. It's just full of absolutely detailed research. And you know, if you like compilations like the Sin Alley compilations, Las Vegas Grind, that kind of thing that was being reissued at the time in the 80s, it's a great read. I wish I had more copies of this magazine, Kicks. Just take you so long to read all these articles with the tiny typeface. I think this is probably even before people had certainly did desktop publishing. I think even that was quite a new thing at the time. And even this type looks like it was done on a pretty early sort of word processor, or even a typewriter. Some quite nice adverts and some nice comic strips in here as well. But yeah, and then a page about fanzines, of which there were many at the time. There you go. Kicks magazine. Nice advert for a 50s exploitation film there, The Choppers, starring Arch Hall Jr. The next fanzine from the USA is more sort of contemporary music from the late 80s, and it's Forced Exposure magazine. Fairly glossy cover. Again, lots of small type. This magazine was available over here. You didn't have to send off for it, and that's something that is worth mentioning, because at the time it was much more easier to buy magazines from the USA or records from the USA when the postage was more affordable. It's just not affordable now, and so I feel quite sort of cut off from ordering anything from the USA, but it was different in the late 80s and early 90s. So Forced Exposure featured the writing talents of Byron Coley, who I still think writes now for The Wire magazine. But, you know, flicking through issues of Forced Exposure, you get a real taste of what was going on in sort of underground music in the late 80s, early 90s, and the writing style of Byron Coley. Really interesting interview with Butthole Surfers in this one. Is something else altogether. Really kind of a wise ass style of writing, which was much imitated, but there's definitely a streak of humour going through in the style of that Byron Coley used. I'll try to pick out just a random bit of writing by Byron. A Major League, this is a review of a Drunks with Guns LP. A Major League release from these unstable St. Louis Roadhogs. The album contains all of their first 2 7-inches. Pure growling thug rock that only spurts about half a foot into the air because it's too fucking heavy. To not want to bask inside this kind of grisly roar is something I can't understand. Okay, be a dick. Try and keep yourself from gurgling along with New Wave Girl. I dare ya. So, you know, a very sort of casual style, but it was something I used to really enjoy reading through. Pre-internet, remember, we needed this stuff, we needed this information. Not just about music, Forced Exposure, but articles about artists, cartoonists, filmmakers, writers. I think it probably ended in the early 90s and became a distribution service. I'm not sure whether that still exists now, but in its time, Forced Exposure was probably the best zine around. But great, again, the advert's really interesting. Advert for an album by Loop there. Interesting article on science fiction writer K.W. Jeter. Lydia Lunch. So there's quite a lot of, at that time, sort of late 80s, we're talking about post-punk, noise rock, Sonic Youth type stuff. Yes, some sort of garage bands, and also the advent of grunge as well, as I suppose as well. So that's Forced Exposure. Next one is Chemical Imbalance. Looked very similar to Forced Exposure, and again it covered not just music but pop culture and art and comics and books and writers. Edited by Mike McGonigal, who now edits a magazine called Yeti. No, he doesn't. No, he that's not right. He did edit a magazine called Yeti after Chemical Imbalance, but now edits a magazine called Maggot Brain. So he's still around. I think the people at Forced Exposure didn't really think much of Chemical Imbalance because they felt it was probably a very arty imitation of Forced Exposure. But there's lots of stuff about art here and underground music. Interesting to see in some of these articles on bands who would later become quite well known, like Galaxy 500. There's a interesting article on Galaxy 500 here in this one. Later issues of this, again, this is from the late 80s, early 90s, did give away 7-inch singles, which I have. Yeah, just lots and lots to read. Again, before we spent all our time reading things on the internet. Article on Daniel Johnston. Yeah, I think it's this issue that has the article on Galaxy 500. Number I don't know what number this one is, but yeah, this included a free record with previously unreleased stuff by Loud Fast Rules, the Mekons, Blue Hippos and Magnolias. So a lot of the bands that are being written about here are, some of them are sort of lost in the mists of time, but others we still recall. This one had a free single with Sun Ra and Ut, and an article by Lester Bangs, who I think Lester Bangs, going back to the first magazine I showed, used to write for Bump magazine. So there we are. I've got quite a few issues of Chemical Imbalance. And that brings to a close this video about just a small selection of some of the late 80s, early 90s American music and art fanzines in my collection. So I hope you enjoyed that little skim through these mags, and I'll see you next time for another Baggy Hi Fi video. So bye for now.